Tonight we open a door that was never meant to be touched. Not rumors, not theory, but testimony spoken by someone who once wore the collar. What he reveals doesn't just challenge belief, it threatens to shake the very ground of history itself. Hidden vaults, locked archives, forgotten manuscripts, a timeline rewritten not by chance, but by design. For years, he served inside the Vatican walls. He walked through chambers most will never see. He read words that were meant to remain sealed forever. This isn't only about forbidden texts or ancient rituals, it's about something far greater: control. Control of memory, of knowledge, of time itself. Centuries of silence shaped the world, while eyes turned to Rome for salvation. Now, for the first time, a voice from inside breaks that silence. Not in whispers, not in shadows, but in full. They say once you wear the collar, you belong to the church forever. What they don't say is what happens when the collar begins to choke. I was one of them. I prayed in Latin. I walked halls of stone where echoes never die. I believed with everything I had. But truth has a way of slipping through cracks. And once it enters, it never leaves. I did not leave because I'd lost faith in God. I left because of what I found hidden in His name. There are doors in the Vatican that most priests will never unlock. Passages under passages. Keys handed to only a few. I was one of those few. At first I thought it was an honor proof of loyalty, but the deeper I went, the darker it became, until only questions remained. One night still burns in my memory. A storm over Rome, lights flickering. I was called to assist in a part of the archive almost no one knows exists. No phones, no cameras, only silence, dust, and the smell of something old like dried blood pressed into parchment. I saw scrolls older than history itself, languages I couldn't read, yet somehow understood, stories of creation, of time, of us, that told a different version than the one I had preached. Not half-truths, not mistakes, a script, a performance, and we were the actors. For months, I stayed quiet. I gave sermons, I offered confessions. I smiled before bishops whose eyes held secrets, but inside, I was falling apart. The lies weren't just written in the forbidden pages. They were in the silences, the missing names, the erased years, the stories we were told not to tell. Eventually, I couldn't stay. No announcement, no goodbye. I left the collar on the altar and walked into the night. For years I stayed silent. But silence is also kind of prison. And tonight, I'm done being a prisoner. There are truths the world must hear, not to demolish belief, but to rebuild it on something genuine. Not through fear or domination, but through honesty. This is my confession. Not a hushed secret in a dark booth, but a declaration spoken into open air. Because the gravest offenses are rarely lone acts. They live inside systems, cloaked by vestments, sanctified by ceremony, hidden behind gilded walls. If you think you know the Vatican, think again. What I witnessed was never meant to be revealed. What I read was never meant to be recalled until now. The monastery was always quiet, not peaceful so much as watchful, as if the stones themselves listened. When I arrived as a young seminarian, I believed it was holy ground, where questions met answers and doubt melted into devotion. The longer I stayed, the clearer it became that the silence was not sacred. It was imposed. We were taught to read scripture, but only in the prescribed way. Ask too many questions, even gentle ones, and the older priest would smile and change the subject. Persist, and you were told to pray and fast. That was the code. Stop asking. Some books were explored in detail, others were mentioned once, and then disappeared from conversation. Certain names came only as late-night whispers when lights were low and someone dared to speak without fear. One class on early Christian history altered everything for me. The lecturer stuck rigidly to his notes, careful and measured, but in one moment he slipped, naming a text I had never heard of, the Gospel of Thomas. He froze, scanned the room, and said, "Forget that. It was never canonical." He moved on, but I could not let it go. Later, alone, I asked him about it. He stared at me, voice barely above a whisper, and said some books had been excluded for very good reasons. Then he walked away. That night, I went to the small monastery library. The lights were low, and most volumes sat behind glass. The books available to us were uniform: approved translations, doctrinal summaries, lives of saints. I began to notice what was missing: no original manuscripts, no dissenting perspectives, no space for interpretation, just curated knowledge repeated until it became unquestionable truth. We were not merely studying scripture. We were learning to think within a framework, or more precisely, to avoid thinking beyond the limits imposed on us. It was subtle. No one ever ordered us to stop thinking. They nudged us back on track every time our curiosity wandered. Over time, most of my peers accepted it. They nodded, they recited, they passed examinations and called it faith. A few of us, however, lingered in the garden after Vespers or huddled in library corners. We spoke of books we were forbidden to touch and of questions left unanswered. We began to ask whether we had come to seek truth or to forget it. In that place, truth was not denied outright, it was filtered. We were taught honesty, but also to never deviate from the script. And inside that enforced quiet, something older than belief began to stir not faith, but the sense that beneath layers of ceremony and deference, another story waited, buried and patient. It wasn't on any map, no signpost in the catalogs. Still, everyone in the Vatican seemed to know of its existence. They simply refused to name it. Like a secret chamber carved into the stones themselves, hidden but visible to those who knew where to look. I found it by accident. I had been assigned to help an archivist in a remote wing of the Vatican Library. The work was tedious, sorting Latin codices, dusting brittle scrolls, transcribing inventory cards. The further you moved from the sunlit reading rooms, the air changed cooler, denser, as if time itself slackened with each step away from daylight. That afternoon I was pushing a book cart down a basement corridor when I noticed a small passageway I had never seen. Nothing distinguished it. A plain arch, a worn wooden door, but the light above it was on. That was strange. Those lower halls were normally sealed. I should have kept walking. I should have followed the order and left it alone. But something tugged me toward the doorway. The door was ajar. When I eased it open, it didn't creak. Inside was a tight spiral stair, dim bulbs struggling to keep the darkness at bay. No patrols, no surveillance, only an oppressive quiet. At the bottom, a heavy barrier of iron and aged wood blocked the way. There was no latch, and yet it gave when I pushed. The room beyond was not like any library space I'd seen. There were no tidy stacks, no neat labels, no catalog cards. It was a disorder of knowledge, bundles of scrolls heaped on tables, untitled volumes, manuscripts and scripts I couldn't place. Some were improperly stored, unrolled as if someone had been reading them and never returned them to their shelves. The air carried more than dust. It carried the scent of ages, of paper and leather that had not felt a human hand in centuries. One sheet lay face up with strange sigils, arranged in concentric circles, cosmic diagrams, margin notes in Latin, Greek, and an older tongue I couldn't identify. The page did not simply recount, it cautioned, a warning pressed under the ink. I didn't hear the door close behind me. I sensed another presence and turned. An elder priest stood in the doorway. He did not shout. He did not startle. He regarded me as if I had been expected, as if my arrival had been part of some longer plan. For a moment, he only looked. Then, without accusation, without anger, he said, "You weren't meant to be here." He didn't scold me. He didn't issue a threat. He simply took the parchment from my hand, set it aside, and motioned for me to leave. I never spoke of that night again. But from then on, I understood the Vatican doesn't just preserve history. It edits it, it curates it, and sometimes it buries it so deeply that even those sworn to protect it forget what it was they were guarding in the first place. It all began with a detail so small it should have been meaningless. A single footnote in a massive theological commentary we were assigned during training. It referenced a verse that wasn't in the Bible we studied. At first, I assumed it was a mistake in printing, but the more I searched, the stranger it became. The verse existed, just not in the editions we were permitted to use. That discovery became an itch I couldn't ignore. I began comparing texts, the Latin Vulgate, the Greek Septuagint, Coptic codices, fragments in early Syriac, and slowly a pattern emerged. Passages shifted in tone, names disappeared, entire sections were shortened, rewritten, reshaped. Some scriptures ended abruptly, others carried warnings scrawled in the margins. It was as if the words had been cut to fit a design, forced into a single uniform story. One night stands out in my memory. Through unofficial means, I obtained a copy of the Gospel of Thomas. It was scanned from a decaying manuscript, unearthed in Egypt, and translated by independent scholars. It was unpolished, raw, untouched by centuries of editing. It didn't recount miracles or resurrection. It was different, just sayings, riddles, teachings. And yet, those sayings struck me deeper than anything I had read. They spoke not of a savior descending from above, but of a guide pointing inward, a man urging people to seek truth within themselves rather than surrender thought to authority. I brought it to a priest I trusted, one I thought might understand. He never opened the cover. He glanced at the title, closed his eyes, and told me it was heresy, dangerous. Not because it was false, he admitted, but because it wasn't meant to be seen. He explained that long ago, the church made a choice to protect the faithful by giving them one message, clear, clean, simple. Everything else, no matter how profound, had to be set aside. He said, the early councils decided what counted as sacred and what did not, what was inspired and what was inconvenient. That single word haunted me. Inconvenient, not false, not immoral, simply unsuitable. I kept digging. The Gospel of Mary, the Book of Enoch, the Gospel of Philip, they all exist. They were excluded. Some honored a feminine divine presence. Others spoke of celestial cycles and alternate views of sin. Each was not annihilated, but tucked away, hidden behind locked doors, or rewritten into tongues only a few could decode. It became obvious. The Bible we carry is not a flawless archive. It is a selected anthology chosen by humans, reshaped across centuries, translated to serve a purpose to guide belief, yes, but also to direct power. When people claim the Bible is the literal word of God, they rarely imagine how many human hands edited it, how many voices were muted, how many stories were filed away as heresy. Perhaps the most disturbing truth wasn't that pages were missing. It was that their absence was never supposed to be noticed. What seemed like an ordinary lecture on liturgical calendars turned into another door. We were learning how Easter set the first full moon after the spring equinox. Straightforward, until a student asked what no one had asked before. What if the heavens no longer matched those dates? Silence fell. The teacher smiled and offered tradition as an answer, a shrug toward authority. That was my first real alarm. If the church claimed to follow the sky, why ignore the sky itself? I stayed late in the library and pulled down an old almanac. As I compared dates, inconsistencies multiplied. The spring equinox had slowly shifted over the centuries. What once belonged to one sign now sits in another. Yet the church taught alignment as if nothing had moved. It hadn't adjusted, it decreed. We use the Gregorian calendar today, adopted in 1582. Before that came the Julian system, and before that, other civilizations tracked the heavens with astonishing precision, using stones and shadows to mark solstices and lunar cycles. They adapted when the sky drifted. The church, by contrast, fixed festivals named holy days and set a rhythm that often drifted away from astronomical reality. Christmas, for example, lands nowhere near the likely birth of Jesus. It was positioned to supplant older, pre-Christian midwinter rites. Easter overlays springtime fertility observances that predate Christian symbolism. Even the 7-day week became tuned to scripture rather than to natural cycles. If the church had admitted this, it might have been harmless, but instead these choices were taught as absolute divine timing rather than human convention. I began to ask, if time itself could be adjusted to fit a narrative, what else had been altered? What other pieces of reality had been trimmed to make the story neat? Some will say it doesn't matter. They find comfort in certainty. But when the scaffolding of certainty is built by human hands, the foundation can be moved. They argued those dates were symbolic, that meaning mattered more than precise alignment. But when the sky no longer matches the story you were taught, something fractures. A fissure opens, and through it urgent questions rush in. If the church could bend time for the sake of liturgy, what prevented it from altering history, memory, even what people accepted as truth? That night I stepped outside and looked up. The heavens were sharp and clear. The stars watched like indifferent witnesses. They didn't care what label we gave a day. They traced a different narrative, one written in light and silence, and in the space between that sky and our customs, I realized the heavens were right. We had drifted away from reality. There is a corridor in the Vatican few ever see. No tour groups, no cameras, just endless rows of cabinets in a hush that feels unnatural. Once I was assisting an older archivist when he stepped out to take a call. I was told to remain in the room, but curiosity pulled me a few steps down the hall. That's when I found a drawer left slightly ajar. Inside were folders stamped with saintly names I'd never encountered: Manolfus, Labrada, Sicarius of Bronto. The entries were typed in precise Vatican script, but they felt wrong. Many had no birthplaces. Several lacked dates. The accounts read like myth visions, miracles, martyrdoms that belong more to legend than verifiable lives. One file's cover simply read, "No longer recognized." The phrase sank into me like cold water. When the archivist returned, I asked about one of the obscure saints. He paused, then said, "Not every saint stays a saint. Sometimes stories unravel, evidence vanishes, or never existed." His casual reply haunted me. I began tracing the officially canonized names and hit repeated dead ends. Churches named for people with no solid records, statues of saints with no contemporary mentions, miracles recorded centuries after the supposed events. At first I blamed sloppy record-keeping histories messy. Then I found internal memos from the 1960s. During a sweeping review called The Reform of Roman Hagiography, dozens of saints were quietly removed or downgraded. Some were labeled pious fables. Others were judged likely fictitious. The Vatican made no public spectacle of it. The changes were folded into files and left to silence. That was when the pattern became obvious. Sainthood was not only a spiritual honor, it was a tool. These narratives taught obedience, modeled behavior, and reinforced authority. When a story no longer served its purpose, it could be revised or shelved. Belief, I learned, could be instructed, the faithful guided towards examples the institution preferred. And when necessary, inconvenient stories were simply filed away. But what about the people who had prayed to those saints for generations? The villagers built their lives around relics, children carried their names, festivals circled the calendar. What happens when your guardian is declared a fiction? It made me ask how many other names were invented or quietly erased without anyone noticing. How much of our communal memory rested on figures who existed only on parchment and in pulpit stories? The church didn't need to consign books to flames when it could simply close a dossier and move on. Often, the most dangerous narratives were not the loud ones. They were the ones that vanished without record, leaving no witness to ask why. The day I first saw the chained volumes, I assumed it was preservation. Heavy bindings, iron clasps, chains bolted to solid desks seemed like library etiquette. Then I noticed the difference. These books were not preserved to be read. They were locked to remain sealed, and the language inside was not the plain Latin we used. It was an older, altered Latin, contorted as if to conceal as much as to convey. I remember one manuscript that at first glance looked like parables, but the sentences were layered and dense. Instead of a simple line, God is light, it spoke of divine luminosity as an emanation of metaphysical order. It read clever, almost scholarly, but felt deliberately obscure, as if the phrasing existed to intimidate and exclude. I asked my mentor why these texts weren't translated for ordinary people. His answer was blunt. Not everyone can bear the truth. He said it calmly, as if shielding parishioners from knowledge were a sacred duty. That response showed me a pattern. Early documents in Greek or Aramaic were often direct, vivid, sometimes poetic. When those same pieces were rendered into Latin, meaning slipped. Words were added, passages omitted. The Latin copies became authoritative, the versions taught from pulpits and carved into doctrine. What happened was not mere translation, it was alteration. Once I placed an early gospel beside its later Latin edition, the original read, "The kingdom of God is within you." The Latin recast it as, "The kingdom of God is not meant for all to grasp." One small change transforms empowerment into exclusion. It became clear that the true leverage of the institution lay not in vaults or treasure, but in language itself, in which phrases were amplified and which were buried under layers of ritual and obscure vocabulary. In the first centuries of the faith, there were scores of writings, letters, visions, teachings. They did not form a single voice. They argued, disagreed, offered divergent visions. Some spoke of reincarnation, others recorded celestial cycles, and a few hinted at knowledge that would seem like technology out of time. The church chose which voices to elevate and which to silence. Those chosen were translated, copied, celebrated. The others were bound, chained, and hidden. Language became the gate. If the populace could not read the originals, they could not challenge the imposed narrative. The truth was not always destroyed. Often it was encoded, buried in a Latin that most could not parse, and placed under seals and chains that did more than hold books closed. They were quiet, they were fearful, and their obedience wore the mask of reverence. We were taught the Middle Ages where blackout Rome fell, and with it reason and craft. People supposedly stopped reading, technology stalled, progress froze. But what if that narrative is a convenience, not a fact? What if darkness was not merely accidental but deliberate. The thought came to me one night while I was reading an old lecture note tucked away in the archives. It was not marked secret, just neglected. The professor argued that the so-called Dark Ages were not as barren as we'd been told. People did not simply lose knowledge, they were denied access to it. At first, I resisted the idea. Then I began tracing the record and found gaping absences. For nearly 3 centuries, there are few original texts, few verifiable inventions, whole chapters of daily life that vanish. It reads like a dimming of time. That's when I encountered a theory many dismiss, the phantom time idea, the claim that entire stretches of years might have been altered, added, or removed from our chronology, often with the help of powerful institutions. It sounds extreme until you consider how many calendar reforms and date adjustments were made by church authorities, how many surviving documents are distant copies of earlier copies. Even if phantom time is too bold, one truth stands out. The church decided what would endure. Works that contradicted doctrine were purged. Free-thinking scholars were silenced. Libraries fell to fires or were broken apart in the name of purity. Knowledge that survived often lived inside cloistered walls, accessible only to those in habit. Ordinary people were discouraged or forbidden from owning scripture, studying the heavens, or investigating where ideas originated. Ignorance became a virtue and knowledge a guarded privilege. Many innovations commonly credited to later eras, refined glass lenses, sophisticated maps, intricate mechanical devices, appeared to have precursors centuries earlier. Yet their traces vanish and reappear as if by miracle. They were not inventions sprung from nowhere. They were suppressed, concealed, or destroyed so that power could remain unchallenged. The more I read, the less darkness felt like an accident and more like a managed condition. When truth threatens authority, the guardian of that power often acts. In the centuries when the church rose to supremacy, it defined holiness and sin, decided what stories were told and which were erased. This was not merely a loss of facts, it was a withholding of context and access. Once you see that pattern, it changes how you view history, not as an impartial record, but as something edited. They taught us to revere certain orders as humble scholars and missionaries, men of discipline and quiet learning. But beneath that public face were organizations with different aims, known to only a few. The Society of Jesus, founded in the 1500s, is a clear example. From its inception, it was organized differently. Not only a religious order, but a disciplined corps trained in strategy, loyalty, and rigorous obedience. We all knew the familiar vows: poverty, chastity, obedience. But among the senior clergy, there was talk of a fourth vow, never mentioned in catechism, taken only by a select few, and only in secret. Its words were simple, but its weight was immense. This vow pledges absolute obedience directly to the Pope, not just in spiritual matters, but in missions, politics, and silence. Those who swear it promise to go wherever they are sent, to do whatever is commanded without question or hesitation, and the tasks they are assigned rarely appear in any history book. I once spoke with a Jesuit who had served in multiple countries under different names. He claimed his work was spiritual. When I pressed him, he only smiled faintly and said, "Spiritual warfare takes many forms," then looked away, as if he had already spoken too much. The Jesuit chain of command does not end with the Pope. It runs through the Superior General, the man known as the Black Pope, not for skin color, but for his robes, his title, his influence. While the Pope appears in public blessing crowds, the Black Pope operates in shadows. Few know his name, and even fewer understand his power. He commands thousands of Jesuits worldwide, overseeing schools, missions, and covert networks. They preach devotion, discipline, but they also gather intelligence, shape politics, and quietly inhabit rooms where laws are drafted and wars are planned. The fourth vow binds members not only to God but to an unseen hierarchy of control. Once taken, there is no turning back. They cannot speak of their actions nor question their orders. They move like ghosts through the world's systems, leaving no trace. Disobedience carries consequences, they simply vanish. Some dismiss these claims, saying Jesuits are merely educators and missionaries. But I have seen the documents. I have read the unspoken codes. I have met men who never introduced themselves by their real names. The church hides much, but the Jesuits do more than guard secrets, they enforce them. The fourth vow is the lock that holds everything in place. Not all soldiers wear armor, and not all battles are fought with swords. Some are waged in silence, with ink, whispers, and loyalty so absolute it becomes invisible. Beneath the Vatican is a room few speak of. No stained glass, no gilded trim, just cold stone walls and thick wooden doors. They call it a tribunal. It is no courtroom in the conventional sense. No jury, no audience, just a table, a chair, and a handful of men in black robes who question and determine outcomes. I was there once as a silent observer, witnessing something ancient and hidden. They labeled it the Doctrinal Review, but the title was a mask. It was a trial, not for criminals, but for thinkers, questioners, those daring enough to suggest the world might be different than the church claimed. The man on trial was a priest, elderly, thin, with soft eyes. His offense, writing a paper proposing that Genesis might be metaphorical, the creation unfolded over eons, and that science and faith need not conflict. He had shared it only with fellow scholars, yet one had reported him. The questioning was precise, sharp, designed to ensnare, to expose even a hint of deviation. Did he believe the Bible was literal truth? Did he deny the divine creation of humanity? Did he fully submit to the Church's teachings on the origin of life? He answered carefully, respectfully, but none of it mattered. The room had already decided he was convicted of doctrinal deviation, not heresy. The Church no longer uses that word often, but the result was the same. He was silenced, forbidden from teaching. His notes were confiscated. His reputation was quietly erased. No fire, no chains, just removal, and the world was never meant to hear from him again. Later, I discovered the old heresy files, tucked away in a cabinet, marked with faded Latin titles I recognized. Bruno burned alive for suggesting the stars were not fixed. Galileo silenced for asserting the earth moved. Lesser-known mathematicians, healers, visionaries, punished for seeing too clearly or speaking too soon. The Church didn't merely oppose science. It feared it not because it threatened God, but because it threatened control. Each new discovery shifted power. Every theory challenged the idea that only the Church held the keys to truth. Some of the files contained confessions, some voluntary, some coerced, others extracted under torture. They were precise, cold, final. Once labeled a heretic, your fate was sealed. And centuries later, many of their ideas would be vindicated. What frightened me most wasn't just the past, it was how easily those mechanisms still functioned. The rituals, the silence, the secret trials in forgotten rooms. Not every prison has bars. Some are built from rules, fear, and the unspoken warning. Ask the wrong question, and you may never ask again. It began with a simple task. I was organizing old papal records for a senior archivist, births, deaths, blessings, official decrees, routine work, names on a page. But something felt wrong. Some names appeared in one book, yet vanished from another. Certain popes had no origin, no background, no trace, just a title and a name, as if they had emerged from nowhere and vanished again. Initially, I blamed sloppy record keeping. Centuries of hand copied documents are bound to have errors. But the deeper I looked, the stranger it became. One pope had 3 different death dates. Another had miracles attributed to him, but no writings, coins, or any evidence he had ever lived. Yet the church recognized him as a legitimate pontiff for over a century. I found one case that was particularly odd. A pope who supposedly ruled for 10 days, then was secretly buried. No explanation, no details, just a fleeting mention in one document and silence elsewhere. No tomb, no portrait, no proof, yet his name appeared in official Vatican chronicles as if repetition confirmed reality. It felt like tracing ghosts. I mentioned it to a colleague who whispered for me not to dig too deeply. Sometimes, he said, names were added to maintain a clean timeline, to smooth transitions of power, especially in the early centuries when politics and religion were intertwined. You couldn't always tell one from the other. These weren't merely gaps, they were entire lives constructed to hold the structure in place. I began reading alternative histories, scholars' writings highlighting the same anomalies. They spoke of phantom popes, paper popes figures who existed only in records, leaving no mark on the world. In some cases, historians even debated whether certain popes were actually the same person under different names. And then there was a curious legend of Pope Joan, the female pope, denied by the church but whispered about in corners across Europe. Some claimed she ruled disguised as a man. Others said her story was a cautionary myth, crafted to distract or intimidate. Either way, her tale revealed the truth. The papal record was not flawless. In a faith built on tradition, the list of popes is sacred, meant to be an unbroken chain from St. Peter to the present, a golden link of authority. But when you uncover weak links or links that never existed, the entire chain begins to shake. Popes were human, chosen by men, not angels. Names were sometimes inserted for politics, power, or to cover missing years. What I once believed was history carved in stone now feels more like ink on water. Some names never truly existed, mere echoes maintaining the illusion. There was another quiet morning in the archives, the kind where the only sounds are the flick of ancient pages and footsteps echoing on marble. I was assigned to catalog a stack of uncategorized documents. Most were mundane sermons, drafts of papal letters, old financial records. But near the bottom, I found something different. An unlabeled, unsealed envelope with a single pressed symbol in wax. Not a cross, not a papal crest, but something older, something unfamiliar. Inside was a document in flawless Latin, yet hurried and almost panicked in tone. The handwriting shifted midway, suggesting multiple authors. The opening pages discussed astronomy, celestial timelines, and alignments. Then the text shifted abruptly, describing the recalibration of time itself. Dates moved, events were reassigned, centuries blurred, popes and emperors were repositioned on the timeline as if history were a puzzle being rearranged behind closed doors. Some events were duplicated under different names in separate regions. Others were entirely fabricated to cover long periods of silence. The document insisted these adjustments were necessary for the church's stability, a correction for the faithful. My hands shook as I read. One section detailed instructions for altering certain documents before public release, while the originals were to be sealed in secret vaults. It even included a list of the changes, dates, names, locations, everything meticulously noted. Near the end, a paragraph in red ink warned that if the truth ever emerged, it would unravel not only church history, but the foundations of Western civilization itself. The notion of progress the legitimacy of monarchies, even the credibility of science and astronomy. The note added that most people would never believe it. The illusion was too deeply woven into culture, education, and collective memory. I didn't know what to do. I could ignore it, pretend I hadn't seen anything. I could report it and watch it vanish again into the vaults. But something inside me broke. I thought of students learning history from carefully edited books, of faith shaped around timelines adjusted like stage scripts. I remembered all I had already uncovered: the chained manuscripts, the phantom popes, the missing saints. This was the final straw. I left the archive that day and never returned. No packing, no farewells, just walking away. Once you glimpse the blueprint behind the illusion, you cannot return to pretending it's real. And perhaps that's exactly why they hide it. Not because the truth is unbearable, but because once you see it, questions start forming, and that is what they fear most. A world full of people who ask why. History is supposed to be a chain of events, each year following the next, like footsteps across time. But what if some of those steps were fabricated? What if entire centuries were inserted deliberately? It sounds insane until you notice the cracks. And once you do, you can never unsee them. This is known as the phantom time hypothesis. The theory claims that nearly 300 years of our calendar never truly occurred, roughly from 614 to 911 AD. That span encompasses events, rulers, and the early rise of the Holy Roman Empire. According to this idea, those years were invented to make a fabrication appear true. At the center of this alleged manipulation are two figures, Otto III and Pope Sylvester II. Otto was a powerful, ambitious emperor fascinated with Rome's golden past. He wanted not just to be a king, but a Roman emperor. Yet the era he lived in didn't match that ambition. The proposed solution? With Sylvester's guidance, they allegedly shifted the timeline, moved the calendar forward, and inserted centuries, making it appear Otto ruled in the symbolic year one, a holy number chosen to legitimize and mythologize his reign. Pope Sylvester was no ordinary pontiff. Before his ecclesiastical role, he was a scholar, a mathematician, and if you believe some of the darker whispers, a magician. He understood astronomy, numbers, and calendars. He would have known how to manipulate chronology without anyone noticing. Most people of the time could neither read nor track years. The church dictated time through bells and feast days. When authorities declared it was the year one, the populace accepted it, and history adapted to the illusion. Yet traces remain. Archaeologists note a surprising scarcity of artifacts from this period. Architectural progress stagnated. Records are unusually sparse. It's as if time slowed or recycled old stories. Some manuscripts even repeat themselves. Same battles, different names, same rulers in different regions, as if history was copy-pasted to create new chapters. If this theory holds, what we call the Middle Ages might be a carefully constructed illusion, a stage play designed by men controlling how the future would remember the past. The church wasn't merely recording history, it was rewriting it, one date at a time. Once you notice the gaps, history stops feeling like a record. It feels like a script, pre-written by unseen hands. The stars, however, do not lie. They rise and fall with perfect precision. Long before telescopes or charts existed, humanity relied on the sky to mark time, plant crops, travel, and remember. When history was rewritten, the stars became a silent witness, an enemy of forgery. No matter how many documents were altered, the sky maintained the true chronology. I first encountered the term chronoastronomy in a hidden corner of the Vatican Library, a study of time through the stars, quietly hinting at what had been concealed. It was written in a dusty notebook left behind by a visiting scholar. The term was chronoastronomy, using the stars to verify historical dates. Eclipses, comets, and other celestial events follow precise patterns. Using math, you can calculate backward and know exactly when they occurred. So if a medieval text claims a lunar eclipse occurred on the night a king was crowned, we can check it, and often it doesn't match. Many of the church's dates conflict with what the sky tells us. At first, a few historians whispered their concerns. Then they spoke louder, pointing to astronomy to show that key events might be assigned to the wrong centuries. Some popes and emperors could have lived simultaneously, even though records placed them generations apart. These were not minor discrepancies. They exposed deep cracks in the chronological foundation, yet whenever someone got close to proving it, they were silenced. I remember one astronomer from Eastern Europe, brilliant, methodical. He had built a computer model reconstructing the sky over 20 years. Comparing it to medieval texts, he found dozens of inconsistencies. He presented his work in a small lecture hall and a few weeks later vanished from the academic world. His papers were removed, his notes destroyed, and even his name began disappearing from records. Another was a priest studying ancient Egyptian star charts, convinced they told a completely different timeline, where events labeled medieval occurred centuries earlier or never at all. When he tried to present his findings to the Vatican's Historical Council, they called it blasphemy and revoked his credentials. The Church's official stance has always been that faith and science can coexist, but only when science does not question the Church's timeline. The moment the stars contradict the script, silence descends. Some argue the Gregorian calendar reform was a simple technical correction, but what if it also served as a reset button, erasing evidence that time itself had been tampered with? The stars remain watching, unyielding. They remember every night. The men who feared them feared more than celestial events. They feared truth itself, which does not need a pulpit, only light. Unable to silence the stars, they silence the people who listen to them. There is a room deep within the Vatican, thick with the scent of dust, leather, and secrets. It is not the archive most speak of. Older, quieter, nearly impossible to find. It is filled with maps, hundreds, perhaps more, rolled in drawers, mounted under glass, maps that contradict everything we are taught. I was allowed inside only once, under strict supervision. The guide spoke little, merely pointing and nodding. I was told to look, but not take notes, touch, or ask questions. The first thing I noticed were coastlines that no longer exist, islands drawn in the middle of oceans now empty, mountain ranges where there should be plains, entire continents shaped incorrectly. Some maps depicted Antarctica without ice, with rivers and forests. Others marked the middle of the Atlantic with cities, names unknown, places that officially never existed. One map even had a note scribbled in Latin in the corner. When I translated the note later, it read, "Beware the lands that vanished." I saw maps depicting civilizations we are told never interacted, trade routes spanning impossible distances, temples marked in regions still unexplored today. The more I examined them, the clearer it became. These weren't simple artistic errors. They were glimpses into a version of Earth we are no longer allowed to accept. Some maps were copies of older charts, with layers of ink showing attempts to erase or correct names. Yet beneath the corrections, the original truth lingered. One map in particular stays with me. A globe sketch from the early 1400s showed both Americas long before Columbus, not as blank spaces, but detailed with village names, rivers, and symbols resembling pyramids. When I pointed it out, the archivist shook his head. "This one is not for public eyes," he said. "Why would the church hide maps that contradict its own history?" Because maps are power. They don't just show where you are, they reveal where you've been. If enough people saw the old maps, they might start questioning the new ones. Whoever controls the map controls borders, names, and memory itself. The Vatican doesn't just guard theology, it guards geography. Hidden in those drawers are the roads to places we've been told never existed or worse. Places that still exist but are deliberately concealed. Maps don't forget. They wait. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't getting lost. It's discovering you were never where you thought you were. There's a pattern buried in the stories we're told. The deeper you dig, the more it seems names were swapped. Inventors become saints. Experiments rewritten as miracles. Knowledge turned into myth. The past wasn't erased, it was rebranded. I first noticed this while studying records from an early monastery famous for healing. Scrolls describe people recovering from illnesses that should have been fatal. Bones mended overnight. Fevers broken with a touch. The bishop credited saints. Yet in the margins, someone had scribbled ingredients, temperatures, procedures, more like a medical journal than divine intervention. Over time, I found more examples. A man purifying water with minerals, later canonized. A woman teaching villagers celestial navigation, later turned into a mystical figure following divine signs. Her original maps were gone, only prayers remained. Knowledge was disguised as faith. When I asked an older priest about it, he smiled sadly. He said the church didn't hate knowledge, it feared what happened when knowledge outpaced faith. People start asking why. When that happens, they stop needing blessings. They stop needing those who bless. So instead of banning ideas outright, they were clothed in ritual. Science became miracles, tools became relics, telescopes became the eyes of heaven, books became visions. One file I discovered told the story of a young man who built a device to measure rainfall and predict floods. He wasn't accused of heresy because it failed, it worked too well. Local leaders feared that people would trust machines over miracles. After his death, the church quietly canonized him, calling his invention a divine gift, while the actual device was hidden. This wasn't only about power, it was control over memory. Shape how people remember the past, and you control how they envision the future. A world where progress comes from prayer, not trial and error, where innovation is divine, not dangerous. We think of saints as men and women glowing with virtue, but perhaps some were brilliant thinkers, tinkerers, healers, observers of nature, silenced in life, worshipped in death. The line between miracle and invention is thinner than we're taught. Sometimes the greatest miracle is that knowledge survives only as legend. Scientists weren't destroyed, they were turned into saints. It's easier to worship what you don't understand than admit someone solved it before you. Monks appeared harmless, heads bowed, robes trailing, hands stained with ink copying scripture. But some were spies. Monasteries weren't just houses of worship, they were information hubs. In a largely illiterate world, monks held the keys to knowledge. And with those keys came power, the kind that didn't need swords or armies, only silence and ink. Every monastery had a scriptorium for copying text, but not every text was faithful. I found documents with paragraphs scratched out, pages rewritten. One monk confessed in a letter that he had been ordered to remove names, rewrite events, and adjust dates not for falsity, but because the facts didn't serve the church's version of truth. Monks traveled under the guise of pilgrimage, but returned with more than prayers, news, gossip from courts, reports on strange teachings, warnings of heresy. They were the church's eyes and ears long before governments had intelligence networks. If a village built a curious machine, or a scholar taught dangerous ideas, a monk often heard first, and the message climbed the chain. The result could be a quiet visit from a priest, a public trial, or simply vanished records. One file described a coastal monastery that received a book from a traveler on tides, wind, and lunar cycles. The abbot read it, praised it, then burned it. Knowledge that could reduce dependence on God was considered dangerous, better lost than learned. This wasn't mere censorship, it was strategic memory control. Some monasteries had hidden vaults where banned texts were preserved, unseen by the public but kept for future use. The quiet, candlelit halls, the prayers, the routine, they concealed the network of surveillance. Behind the ink lay a knife, and the most unsettling part was how effective it all was. Entire revolutions of thought were stopped before they began, not with fire or swords, but with a whisper, a note, a missing page. The monks weren't just preserving history, they were shaping it, gatekeeping it, editing it. They didn't need armies, they controlled the past, and when you control the past, you shape the future. Not every monk was a spy, but enough were to make you question what truly hid behind those walls and how many truths were locked away in silence. Most people walk into cathedrals and see beauty, the stained glass, the soaring ceilings, statues staring down like silent guardians. But I was taught to look deeper, not at what was shown, but at what was hidden. It began in a cathedral known for its strange architecture. Tourists admired the bells and candles, but I noticed patterns, geometric shapes tucked into arches, perfect ratios in window placements, carvings that didn't match the official stories, lions with human eyes, angels holding tools resembling compasses, spirals echoing ancient knowledge of the stars. One statue in particular caught my attention, hidden behind a pillar, barely visible unless you knew where to look. It showed a man with an open book, but it wasn't the Bible. The letters were in a forgotten language, and his eyes were closed, guarding knowledge rather than sharing it. Many cathedrals were built in the shape of a cross, but some had secret blueprints underneath, labyrinths etched into the floor, measurements tied to planetary movements, builders who were not just craftsmen but mathematicians, engineers, maybe even members of secret brotherhoods, encoding ideas that would have been burned if spoken aloud. Even the positioning of certain cathedrals told a story aligned with solstices, eclipses, and constellations, a kind of stone astronomy baked into the bones of the building. Why would a house of God align with the stars unless the builders knew something they weren't allowed to speak? One carving haunted me for days, a tower being built, halfway transforming into a tree. Its branches wrapped around a globe, but instead of a cross, it bore a compass. Below, etched in silence, were the words, "Seek truth." When I mentioned these things to older priests, they brushed them off. Artistic choices, they said. Symbols of faith, they said. But I could see it in their eyes, they knew. Maybe not the full truth, but enough to be. The more I explored, the more it seemed the builders were leaving warnings, or maybe maps, not of places, but of ideas. Hidden truths carved into stone, so they would survive fire, censorship, and time. Cathedrals were meant to teach the illiterate, yes, but they didn't just teach scripture. They whispered secrets to those who knew how to see and listen. Not every message was about God. Some were about stars, knowledge, power. The church could control words, but stone doesn't burn. When you begin to see these carvings not as decoration but as defiance, you start to realize how much of our history was carved in rebellion, right beneath the eyes of faith. Europe is haunted not by spirits or demons, but by machines, traces of inventions that shouldn't exist, ruins of systems no one can explain, tools buried in dust that feel too advanced for their time. They call them anomalies. I call them mechanical ghosts. It began in an old, overgrown monastery garden. Beneath the roots, I discovered a system of pipes and channels far more complex than anything in medieval textbooks. It wasn't just a well or aqueduct that filtered water, cooled the air, collected condensation, almost like ancient air conditioning, but no one knew who built it. Later, I found sketches in the margins of a banned manuscript spinning gears, winding cranks, moving parts. One looked like a mechanical clock, another, a loom that could program patterns on its own. The manuscript was dated almost 300 years before such machines were supposed to exist. Then, in a church in France, I encountered a strange bell system. It rang every hour perfectly, yet there were no ropes, no one pulling. When I snuck a peek, I discovered a hidden wooden mechanism, gears, levers, all powered by water from a nearby spring. Stories like this are everywhere if you know how to ask. Villagers spoke of ancient mills that ground grain without human touch, bridges carved so perfectly they hadn't eroded in centuries, locks requiring keys no blacksmith could replicate, tools buried with craftsmen containing alloys not found locally for hundreds of years. Some say these were flukes, lucky inventions by geniuses lost to time, but too many were hidden, buried, destroyed, or worse, credited as miracles. One document told of a tower in Italy housing a machine capable of mapping stars with incredible accuracy. It burned in a holy war, but survivors described bronze cogs and glass lenses powerful enough to spot ships hours before they arrived. The church often labeled these creations as dangerous, magical, or a challenge to God. Because if humans could build wonders without divine permission, what did that say about the church's authority? So they silenced the machines not by smashing them, but by forgetting them, burying them beneath new buildings, erasing their inventors from memory, and calling their creations fables. But the ghosts remain in basements, in ruins, in texts no one reads anymore. They are the echoes of a Europe far smarter than we've been told, a continent that may have hummed with gears and whispered with steam long before the industrial age. We didn't move forward naturally, we were pushed back. The machines left behind are proof. The first time I walked into a church-run classroom, I thought it was a place of light, of learning, of truth. Over the years, I realized it was something else entirely, a place designed to make you forget. Not in the ordinary sense, losing a book, misplacing a key, but in a deeper engineered way. Lessons were rigid: memorize scripture, follow timelines, recite lists of saints and sinners. Questions were allowed, but only the safe kind. Ask why God created the stars and you were praised. Ask why those stars no longer matched the church calendar and you were warned. I once asked why certain ancient civilizations weren't mentioned in the Bible. The teacher's smile faded. Some things are not meant to be questioned, he said, moving on. That was the beginning of the silence. Every book had missing pages. Every timeline had missing years. Maps were simplified. The thinkers celebrated were always the same: Augustine, Aquinas, a handful of poets. No astronomers, engineers, or rebels were mentioned. It wasn't just about what they taught, it was how they taught it. Repetition over exploration, recitation over reasoning. Obedience was rewarded, curiosity punished. Silence was praised, wonder discouraged. In one classroom, a chart showed the stages of sin. At the bottom, a single word stood out: doubt. Doubt was the enemy, not just doubt in God, but doubt in history, in church leaders, in official facts. Question the past, and you question the present. Question the present, and salvation felt threatened. Older monks confessed that they had buried their own questions as youths, knowing curiosity could get you reassigned, silenced, or sent to a monastery so remote no one would hear from you again. I found hidden journals in an abandoned school, pages filled with student questions. What really happened to Hypatia? Why do the stars not match feast days? Why are some saints missing from older texts? Why were certain inventions never taught? None of the questions were answered, but in the margins a different hand had scribbled, "This place does not teach, it erases." That was when I understood the church didn't just rewrite history in books, it rewrote it in minds, generation after generation, until no one remembered what had been lost. The school of forgetting was real, and terrifyingly, it's still island. Time feels simple. Days, months, years, following one after the other, like footprints in snow. But what if those footsteps were rearranged? What if the calendar we trust wasn't meant to track time but to control it? The Vatican didn't just shape faith, it shaped the clock. Most people never question calendars, we accept them. But the shift from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar was more than a leap year fix. It was a quiet reset, a rewriting, a deletion of days, and maybe more. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII announced the new calendar. The official reason was that Easter had drifted too far from the spring equinox, so they corrected it. 10 whole days vanished. October 4th was followed immediately by October 15th. People accepted it, told it was for accuracy, but imagine what else could be rewritten when no one questions lost time. 10 days this year, 100 the next century, maybe entire centuries, quietly folded into vaults. As I studied old documents, I noticed patterns that didn't line up, events out of sync, letters referencing rulers who shouldn't have overlapped, weather records that contradicted astronomical data. The stars were telling one story, the church another. Scholars whisper about the phantom time hypothesis, the idea that hundreds of years were added, that emperors and popes inserted themselves into a timeline that never existed. Some claim Otto III and Pope Sylvester II collaborated to push the calendar forward, placing themselves in the symbolic year 1000 to claim authority at a millennium that never truly happened. The more I examined, the more inconsistencies appeared. Gaps in records, overlapping reigns, entire lifetimes missing from public archives, calendars in different regions that didn't align. Church historians' response was always the same: trust us. It's for your own good. But why would faith need to change time? Because time is power. Decide when events occurred, and you control what matters. You can make some stories seem untouchable, make others vanish entirely. Control the calendar, and you control memory. I asked the former bishop about it. He didn't deny anything. He simply said, the church has always done what is necessary to preserve truth. Then he smiled, adding, sometimes truth requires sacrifice. I left feeling cold not because of lost days, but because I was beginning to understand how deeply reality itself could be manipulated. The Vatican had turned time into a tool, a way to rewrite history and bury what they didn't want the world to remember. The church tells the same stories, over and over. A town saved by a saint's touch, a statue that cries real tears, a spring that bursts from dry earth after prayer. Divine intervention, they say. But what if some of these miracles weren't heavenly at all? In one dusty archive, I found a map to a ruined monastery famous for a fountain that never ran dry. Even during droughts, water flowed. Pilgrims called it holy, priests called it blessed. But when I visited, I found stone channels carved beneath the ground and what looked like a primitive water pressure system, mathematics, not miracles. Another story told of a statue of a saint that bowed during Mass, a visible proof of divine favor. Hundreds witnessed it. The church called it a sign, but hidden in a centuries-old maintenance log, I found a note in Latin describing internal gears powered by ropes and weights. The engineer who wrote it was proud of the invention, quietly removed once the church's stance on magic shifted. Faith told people to marvel, history told them to believe, but the truth was machinery, math, and human ingenuity disguised as miracles. Throughout Europe, I discovered blueprints drawn in secret designs for towers that moved with the wind, altars that lit when specific prayers were spoken, crosses that rotated to face the sun at noon. Some were clever illusions, others were real technology, hydraulic systems, magnetism, optics. But instead of celebrating the brilliance of the inventors, these creations were labeled miracles. The inventors were either canonized or forgotten. There was power in the performance. If people believed only saints or priests could bring such wonders, the church held the keys to the divine. Admit that a mechanic or builder could replicate these feats, and faith would lose some of its shine. I once asked an older priest about a rotating tabernacle I had seen in a forgotten chapel. He smiled and said, "Sometimes God works through clever hands." But his tone was careful, like he knew the truth went deeper. Miracles inspired awe and fear. Machines invited questions, and questions were dangerous. So again and again, the church chose miracles over explanation, burying blueprints and raising saints. The world forgot that behind many sacred moments were wires, gears, levers, and minds far ahead of their time. Not every miracle was a lie, but not every miracle was holy either. Some were simply science, misunderstood, dressed in robes and given a halo. People speak of the Renaissance as a sudden burst of genius after centuries of darkness. Art flourished, science returned, ideas exploded like fireworks. But what if it wasn't spontaneous at all? What if the Renaissance was planned to release, a carefully timed awakening, scripted by those who had been hiding knowledge all along? Inside the Vatican, I saw how many texts were locked away, ancient works from Greece, Egypt, Persia, even lost civilizations. These weren't hidden because they were evil, they were hidden because they were powerful. They contained advanced knowledge of medicine, architecture, astronomy, and math far beyond what the church wanted the public to know. Slowly, around the 1400s, that knowledge began to resurface, but not all at once. Scrolls and manuscripts were copied, translated, and passed to trusted scholars. Artists painted with strange symbols. Scientists observed the skies again. Nothing was random. It was as if someone opened the vault just enough to let a few ideas slip out, enough to light the spark, but not enough to burn down the whole system. Letters between cardinals and early thinkers discussed managing the flood of ideas, ensuring discoveries were attributed to safe figures, keeping the church in control of the awakening. Even the artists of the Renaissance were part of this script. Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael, they weren't just painters, they were initiated. Their works hid geometry and ancient codes pointing to older systems of thought. Their art was a puzzle, truth concealed in beauty. One fresco I studied had a spiral hidden in the clouds, a subtle hint of knowledge carefully passed down, just out of plain sight. That spiral matched the layout of a forbidden book I once saw. Behind locked glass, a book that mapped the stars in ways no one was supposed to know for centuries. Coincidence? I doubt it. The Renaissance gave people the illusion of progress, but progress came with a leash. Discoveries had to be church-approved. Books were filtered. Ideas too dangerous were delayed or erased. Those who pushed too far, too fast, were silenced. Galileo experienced this firsthand. Praised one year, imprisoned the next, not because he was wrong, but because he spoke before the world was ready. The more I learned, the more it felt like the past had never truly been lost. It had been stored, locked up, and only handed back when the world was desperate enough to accept it without asking where it had been. The Renaissance was a beautiful moment, but beauty can be a mask. Underneath the light was a shadow, a hand guiding what we remembered and what we forgot. It wasn't an awakening. It was a reveal, and the script had been written long before the curtain rose. Not all flames die in the dark. Some are hidden, carried in silence from one hand to the next across generations. While the Vatican tried to lock the truth away, others worked quietly to protect it. They weren't priests or popes. They were builders, stargazers, philosophers, alchemists, secret keepers. Their mission was simple: keep the light alive. They called themselves many names: Freemasons, Rosicrucians, Knights of the Temple. To outsiders, they appeared as clubs or cults, but inside their symbols told a different story. Geometry, sacred numbers, stars pointing to ancient truths. While the church wrote saints into the heavens, these groups wrote equations on hidden scrolls and carved messages into stone. I once saw a 13th century cathedral blueprint filled with strange symbols. Compass shapes were not tied to scripture, but to stargates, ratios that matched the human body and distant planets. It wasn't just built for worship, it was built to encode knowledge, a silent rebellion in stone. In a dusty cellar beneath a former monastery, I found a copy of a book the Vatican had claimed was lost, an alchemical text with gold ink shimmering like starlight. It spoke of the transformation of light hidden in matter. The priest who owned it had scribbled a warning in the margin. They tried to burn it, pass it forward. The Rosicrucians were said to possess ancient Egyptian knowledge, hidden chambers, libraries buried under the sands. Explorers returning from the Middle East during the Crusades didn't always come back with relics. Some returned with blueprints and secrets the church couldn't translate or dared not touch. The Freemasons were builders and philosophers. They studied Solomon's temple not just as a biblical structure, but as a code, a map. They believed truth was hidden in structure, symmetry, and light itself. They didn't preach it, they embedded it in lodges, architecture, even city layouts. The church accused them of heresy, of conspiracy, but rarely lies. Deep down, the church knew what these groups were preserving: memory. Even alchemists, mocked as dreamers seeking to turn lead into gold, weren't after riches. Many sought something older, a way to unlock lost wisdom, to reclaim what had been sealed. I once met an old man in Portugal claiming to be part of an unbroken line of guardians. He showed me a ring with a symbol older than any cross, a compass within a flame. He said, "We don't fight them, we wait. The truth always returns. It just needs a place to land." That's what these groups were, landing pads for forgotten truths. While the Vatican erased them, they remembered. While the church burned, they preserved. They were the return of the light, and though hunted, silenced, scattered, their flame never went out, it just went underground, and now maybe it's beginning to rise again. One of the most guarded rooms on Earth isn't locked because of gold or jewels, but because it holds something far more powerful: memory, truth, and perhaps pieces of time itself. They call it the Vatican Secret Archives, but that name is misleading. It's not just secret, it's hidden, sealed, and the world has seen only a fraction of what lies beneath. The entrance looks ordinary: a stone hallway, a steel door, a badge scanner. Beyond it stretch over 50 miles of shelves underground, lit by flickering lamps and lined with texts no one outside the church has read for hundreds of years. Some are in lost languages, some written in symbols, some with covers that seem to hum when touched. I remember the first glimpse of the index, a handwritten red leather binder, no thicker than a dictionary. Its entries didn't read like normal books. They were warnings, scrolls from before the flood, banned gospels, testimonies from heretics erased from history, blueprints of machines centuries ahead of their time. One note simply read, "Do not touch unless approved by the Holy Office." Unstable knowledge. Think about that word, so dangerous they must be locked away. Not because of what they are, but because of what they could do. Shift belief, rewrite history, prove we are not who we think we are. There are rumors of Leonardo da Vinci letters describing flight with function, angle, lift, like machines that wouldn't exist for 500 years. Maps showing continents missing from modern globes. Star charts that don't match our current models, and calendars from civilizations erased by time or something worse. One former archivist, who disappeared in the 1990s, claimed he saw a scroll sealed in black wax. Inside were gold leaf symbols, not Latin, not Greek, something older, a language of geometry. He said that when he looked at it too long, it felt like it was looking back. The church claims the archives are restricted to protect fragile documents, to guard truth until it is safe to share. But how long is safe? 100 years? 1,000? Or never? Because if even half of what's listed is real, everything we know about human history, wars, religions, inventions, timelines would change. The hidden vault isn't just a room, it's a boundary between the world we know and the one stolen from us. And the scariest part isn't what's inside, it's that we may never be allowed to see it. Not because we can't understand, but because we might understand too well. There's a version of the Bible most people never see, not lost, not broken, but buried on purpose. Pages ripped out, names erased, teachings that could have changed everything, hidden beneath layers of fear and fire. They called them heresies, but they were something else. A different voice, a different story, a truth too raw for the empire of the church to allow. These were the Gospels they tried to burn. One of the most mysterious is the Gospel of Thomas. It doesn't read like the others. No birth story, no crucifixion, just sayings, words straight from the mouth of Jesus. But the tone is different, intimate, personal, like he was speaking not to crowds, but to seekers. One line stands out more than any other. The kingdom is within you. That idea alone could unravel centuries of control. If the divine is inside you, why do you need a priest? Then there's the Gospel of Mary, not Mary the mother, but Mary Magdalene, the one who was rewritten as a prostitute to strip her of power. In this gospel, she is the one who truly understands Jesus, the one he trusts, the one the other disciples fear because her wisdom threatens their authority. Here, she is not just a follower, she's a teacher, maybe even more. When I first found copies of these Gospels in a locked drawer deep in the archives, I wasn't supposed to open them. The pages were scorched at the edges as if someone had tried to destroy them and then stopped. The Latin labels didn't match the content. It was as though they were trying to hide them even from themselves. There are others too, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of the Egyptians, texts hinting at entirely different versions of the story. Some say Jesus laughed during his betrayal. Others say he never died at all. Some speak of a spiritual resurrection, not a physical one. All of them were banned, all of them hunted, because if people believed these stories, the church's foundation wouldn't be carved from stone, it would be made of silence. You have to ask, why? Why go to such lengths to erase words, burn scrolls, bury libraries, rewrite names? If the official version is the truth, why fear the rest? The answer is simple: control. The banned Gospels empowered the individual. They made the divine something personal, not hierarchical. They made God a whisper, not a throne, and that terrified those who built their empire on obedience. The Gospels they tried to destroy still live in fragments, in whispers, in the quiet spaces between the official lines. And maybe that's enough. Once a truth is written, it can never be fully erased, only delayed, only feared, only eventually rediscovered. There was a time when asking questions could get you killed, not violent or political questions, just simple ones. Why do the stars move? What is the body made of? Where does lightning come from? In an age ruled by the church, even curiosity was dangerous. It was not encouraged, it was feared, because curiosity opens doors. And the Vatican spent centuries making sure some doors stayed shut. Imagine a world where books were locked in chains, where reading the wrong thing could bring torture, where drawing the solar system differently could cost you your freedom. That was not fantasy. That was Europe for hundreds of years. I remember reading an old letter buried in the archives from a monk in the 1400s, caught experimenting with lenses to magnify insects. The letter was short. They have taken my tools. I am not allowed to see what God has made without permission. That one line broke me. He wasn't even defying doctrine. He was just trying to look closer. And yet, even that was rebellion. The church claimed to protect truth, but in reality it controlled it. Scientists who discovered truths that contradicted scripture were forced to retract their findings or face brutal punishment. Galileo had to deny what he saw with his own eyes. Not because he was wrong, but because he was early. The world was not ready for the sky to contradict the Bible. Philosophers, too, were hunted. Men who questioned reality, the soul, the very nature of time, were labeled heretics. Some were imprisoned, some were burned, others simply vanished. Their books disappeared. Their names were scratched out of records. And it wasn't just religion, it was power. If people began thinking for themselves, exploring, questioning. They might realize the church was not the only path to knowledge. That terrified those in charge. I once held a banned book on anatomy. It showed muscles, bones, veins, copied in secret by students risking their lives just to understand the human body. There were blood stains on the pages, not from the drawings, but from those who died protecting them. You might think that was long ago, but echoes remain. Certain books are still restricted, certain questions still silenced. The war against curiosity never ended, it just changed form. The church was never just fighting science, it was fighting wonder, the spark in the human soul that refuses to settle for easy answers. When curiosity became a crime, knowledge became contraband, and history was shaped not by what we learned, but by what we were never allowed to ask. But questions are stubborn, you can bury them, but sooner or later they rise, and when they do, everything changes. It didn't start with torture, it started with doubt. Quiet warnings whispered in church halls, looks exchanged across candlelit rooms, a creeping fear not born of violence, but of the possibility of it. Think the wrong thing, read the wrong words, even dream too far outside the lines, and you could be accused of heresy. In those days, heresy was worse than crime. It was a crack in the perfect wall, a danger to the illusion. The Inquisition didn't just hunt witches or rebels, it hunted thinkers, artists, healers, astronomers, anyone imagining a world that didn't fit Rome's narrow script. Their tools weren't just racks and flames, they used silence, they used shame. Neighbors became spies, students, snitches, families, witnesses. I read a transcript of a young woman's trial. She had simply asked in confession if animals had souls. That's all. The priest reported her. She was interrogated, accused of unnatural thoughts, and her entire life unraveled from a single question. That is how fragile reason became, not because it was wrong, but because it was dangerous. Schools began teaching obedience over thought. Stories replaced science. Saints replaced scholars. Wonder was labeled temptation. Over generations, minds bent inward not out of stupidity, but out of survival. It became safer to believe than to doubt, safer to repeat than to explore, safer to fear the unknown than to reach for it. And the cruelest part, when the bars are made of tradition and the lock of guilt, you don't even try the door. You learn to sit quietly, to pray when you want to ask, to obey when you want to build. I once saw a book of inventions centuries ahead of their time gears that could move entire cities. Designs for clean water systems, flight and light without flame, all sketched out in secret, hidden in walls, behind altars. Their creators knew the Inquisition would destroy their machines before they ever ran. The Inquisition didn't just punish bodies, it crushed imagination. It rewrote what was acceptable to think and feel. When enough minds are trained to fear their own thoughts, chains aren't necessary, the prison lives inside. But thought is patient. Some kept the old ideas alive in code, carvings, paintings that looked religious but hid messages only the curious could read. Minds can be silenced, but not forever. Every time someone remembers to ask why, the silence cracks a little. Eventually, questions flood back, and the world begins to think again, not because permission was given, but because fear ran out of power. They didn't wear crowns, lead armies, or march through cities waving flags. Yet they conquered more than empires ever could. They shaped minds, controlled memory, and bent history itself. They were the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. Their empire wasn't built on land, it was built in silence. At first they looked like a religious order, educated, disciplined, devoted. But beneath the robes and rituals lay calculation, strategy, a system. They understood the true battlefield wasn't out in the world. It was inside classrooms, courtrooms, and courts of power. I remember seeing a hand-drawn map from a dusty drawer in the archives. It didn't mark countries. It marked influence, universities, royal advisors, publishing houses, political confessions. Every dot was a place where a Jesuit served or still served. It looked less like a mission and more like a spiderweb wrapped around Europe. They started with schools, the best ones, training princes, diplomats, writing textbooks, If you learned Latin, math, philosophy, or theology in the 1600s, chances are it was from a Jesuit, and with every lesson came subtle shaping. You didn't just learn facts, you learned how to think and how not to. Then came the courts, not as lawyers, but as confessors, advisors to kings, queens, and generals, whispering behind thrones, offering guidance in the name of God and policy. Jesuits weren't just men of faith, they were men of strategy. They tracked secrets, kept records, knew debts, loyalties, and influence. Some historians say they knew of battles before armies did, and could stop wars with a letter or start them with a rumor. Governments feared and welcomed them. Some countries banned them outright. Exile couldn't stop them, they went underground, changed names, continued their work, teaching, guiding, watching. One document said the pen is the greatest sword, unsigned but unmistakably Jesuit. Their true power was never force, it was formation. You don't need to fight a king if you teach his son. You don't need to burn books if you write them first. People see Jesuits as a religious group. They are, but they are also architects of thought, engineers of memory, guardians of a version of history, serving something far deeper than faith. Their empire was quiet, but vast, woven into the way schools teach, courts justify, governments claim truth and tradition. Silence has always been their sharpest weapon. Most people think of time as fixed, a sunrise, a calendar, a ticking clock. But what if time isn't something we follow, but something we are led through? A hallway designed to guide our perception, our memory, and our belief. And for centuries, that hallway had the designer, the church. They didn't invent time, but they shaped it, bending it, cutting pieces, hiding others, adding some anew, all to craft a version of history that fit their narrative. Control the past, and you control the present. Shape the future before it arrives, and you dictate what people believe is possible. In the archives, I found a small box labeled with a date. Inside were letters between priests and astronomers. They weren't aligning the calendar for accuracy, they were shaping power. Easter's date, tied to the lunar calendar, floats. The resurrection becomes a feeling, not a fact. Feelings are easier to guide than facts. And the switch from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar, 10 days, vanished overnight. Whole lives erased in a bureaucratic rewrite of reality. And who led it? Pope Gregory XIII. The church didn't just change dates, they rewrote reality. Prophecies, comets, signs in the sky, all were timed to serve the narrative. Anything that didn't fit became heresy and disappeared. Control of time meant control of memory. Memory shapes identity, understanding, and expectation. Hold the clock, the calendar, and the prophecy, and you hold the story. The church became timekeepers not just of hours, but of centuries and destinies. They dictated when history began, when it would end, and in doing so became authors of time itself. Walk through a cathedral and you may only see beauty, the soaring arches, the stained glass, the balance of light and shadow, but that beauty is more than decoration. It's a message, a hidden code carved in stone, waiting to be read. Not in words, but in shapes, numbers, and patterns. The architects weren't just building churches, they were building vaults of knowledge. In a basilica in southern France, I stared at the ceiling and felt something off, not wrong, just too perfect. Sunlight hit the altar at noon on a specific day. The geometry, the repetition of circles and triangles, the ratios matching star maps, the hidden golden spiral in the nave. It was not art, it was information. Sacred geometry wasn't decoration, it was a language. Circles for eternity, triangles for balance, squares for foundation. In an age when words were dangerous, math became a medium. Builders hid knowledge in plain sight, under altars, beneath towers, in floor plans of monasteries. One chapel revealed a hidden diagram beneath plaster, a full map of constellations aligned perfectly with the architecture. Centuries later, the church covered it, probably unaware of what the builders intended. But the message was clear. About time, the stars, and truths the Vatican wanted forgotten. Some cathedrals even resonated with sound at specific frequencies, calculated to heal, meditate, or alter awareness. The builders knew what priests either didn't understand or chose to hide. Every window, hallway, and stone could encode a secret, pointing to planets, equations, or ideas deliberately obscured. They carved messages in math and stone for the future, those who would ask why these places hum with something older than faith. And then there's the church, beneath the church. Outwardly, cathedrals display balconies, bells, and ceremonies, but hidden layers operate quietly with a hierarchy unseen by the public. Whispers of it came from an old Roman scholar. Symbols carved where no visitor should see them, seals on envelopes that never passed normal channels. If the Vatican is a stage, he said, this is backstage, the control room, the quiet eye. This secret structure leaves no trace in public documents. Priests rise to power without visible histories, projects launch and vanish, decisions appear to come from nowhere. Rumors speak of a council, not cardinals, not bishops, but something older and quieter. Men without robes, carrying centuries of knowledge and access, meeting in sublevels of Vatican City, rooms without names, corridors leading to vaults guarded not by locks, but by silence. One night in the archives, I stumbled on a restricted journal. It mentioned a place called the Black Room, below the level of official records. The priest cleaning near it wrote only, "I heard voices behind the stone. They knew I was listening." Even the Pope is not immune to this shadow. The idea here is that history itself may have been manipulated, not just events, but the very passage of time. The church, beneath the church, a hidden hierarchy, would have the tools and motive to shape what was remembered, what was erased, and even what was believed to have happened. Popes could serve as the face, while real decisions about politics, money, doctrine, and memory were quietly made elsewhere. This theory gains traction when you look at periods like 614, 911 AD, often labeled the Dark Ages. Few records survive, few constructions, almost no scientific or cultural progress. Mainstream historians attribute this to loss, decay, or societal collapse. But the phantom time hypothesis suggests something more deliberate, that these centuries were invented or artificially added to align political and religious agendas. Otto III and Pope Sylvester II become central figures in this idea they had motive to rule in a symbolic millennium, and means control over the church and calendar. Even the Julian to Gregorian calendar shift in 1582 adds fuel. 10 days vanished overnight. Skeptics claim it was a technical fix, but theorists argue it could hide deeper manipulation, centuries of missing time that were never real. Supporting evidence is subtle. Eclipses, star charts, astronomical records, and even artifacts seem off, misaligned with what should exist for those centuries. Charlemagne's life and empire, for instance, are heavily documented, but often through sources created long after the fact, almost too perfect, as if they were filling in fabricated gaps. The mainstream rejects this hypothesis, citing lost records, human error, and regional chaos. Yet the feeling of manipulation lingers, a quiet suggestion that some portions of history might be deliberately written, deleted, or shifted, a reminder that control over time itself is a form of ultimate power. If you want, I can map out all the patterns and anomalies in medieval European history that support the phantom time hypothesis to see how it connects to the church beneath the church theory. It confirmed what he had long suspected. History wasn't merely recorded, it was engineered. Every gap, every lost manuscript, every mysterious disappearance of knowledge was deliberate. Time itself had been curated like a library. Each year, each ruler, each event placed where it would serve a story, not the truth. And the more he studied the parchment, the more the world outside the Vatican seemed like an illusion. Streets, governments, schools, even prayers, they all followed a pattern, a design that someone had carefully laid out centuries before. The instructions didn't just list what to destroy, they explained why. Certain ideas were dangerous because they empowered individuals, not institutions. Knowledge that encouraged curiosity, that hinted at alternate histories, or that revealed hidden systems of astronomy and engineering, it all had to be neutralized. The document treated it like a garden, weeds removed, seeds carefully planted, rows kept straight, not for punishment, not for zeal, but for order. Memory itself was the tool, obedience the harvest. And there it was in black and faded brown ink, a blueprint for forgetting, crypts, hidden chambers, manuscripts buried beneath foundations, libraries erased, calendars adjusted, all scheduled like holy rituals. The priests could trace the lines of intent through centuries, as if someone had planned the silences before even the first bell of the cathedral had rung. He realized the church wasn't merely spiritual, it was temporal, a keeper of the very flow of history. The final line lingered in his mind. The faithful must not remember what never served the faith. Simple, absolute, and terrifying. The instruction wasn't a suggestion, it was law. That one sentence distilled centuries of control into a single devastating truth. Forgetting was deliberate, knowledge was a weapon. And now, armed with that knowledge, he was no longer safe. The act of seeing, of understanding, had made him a target. They wanted you to believe it was permanent, that knowledge had died and could not return. But the truth is quieter, more patient. It hides in the cracks, in manuscripts that survive fire, in symbols carved into stone that no one notices. It waits in the folds of architecture, in blueprints forgotten beneath monasteries, in the notes of scholars who were silenced but not erased. These truths are older than empires, older than the popes themselves, and they persist because curiosity cannot be completely chained. What the church fears isn't a mob with torches, it's a single mind willing to follow a question wherever it leads. One person reading the wrong book, tracing the wrong map, noticing the pattern of numbers in a cathedral, they can unravel centuries of careful erasure. That's why libraries were locked, texts hidden, calendars shifted, gospels burned, not to protect the faithful, but to protect a story in which the past was curated, the present guided, and the future imagined by hands unseen. And now the threads are fraying. The more people look, the more the inconsistencies show. The kingdom is not above, it is within. Mary Magdalene spoke, and her voice survived in fragments. Machines built in secret predate known technology. Centuries may have been invented. And the moment someone begins to see these patterns, the illusion begins to crack. Faith built on fear can endure for a time, but truth built on curiosity cannot be contained forever. History is waiting for those who listen. The carvings, the maps, the scrolls, they are the breadcrumbs left by those who refuse to let the light vanish entirely. The past was never fully lost. It was hidden, preserved, waiting for the day someone would notice. And that day is always closer than you think. Once you see the story as it truly is, there's no going back. The darkness isn't a wall, it's a door, and it is starting to open. But maybe the truth is simpler than all the fear and whispers. Maybe the light was never lost. Maybe it was simply hidden. Sparks still glow beneath centuries of dust, not just in old books, in crumbling ruins, or behind locked doors. but in you, in the questions that won't leave your mind, in the quiet moments when the story feels too neat, too polished, too edited. The truth isn't gone. It's scattered, locked away in stone, encoded in paintings, blueprints, cathedrals, and myths. The flame never died. They only built walls around it. And now those walls are starting to crack. You don't need permission to wonder. You don't need a collar, a degree, or a blessing to notice what's missing. You only need the courage to look, to read between the lines, to see the shadows where pages were burned, where names were erased. Memory has a way of returning. Knowledge has a way of surviving. This journey was never about hate, revenge, or rebellion. It was about remembering, about reclaiming what was buried, about seeing the world not as they wanted you to see it, but as it truly is. A place filled with knowledge that belongs to no one, yet touches everyone. And maybe the greatest secret isn't hidden in an underground archive beneath the Vatican. Maybe it's in you. Maybe you were never meant to forget. That quiet, gnawing sense that something was wrong, that unease you felt when the history you learned didn't quite add up, wasn't an accident. The so-called heresies, the banned gospels, the missing centuries, they aren't mistakes. They are clues, warnings, proof that truth doesn't come ready-made. It must be discovered. The light was never lost. It was buried under fear, obedience, and silence. But now you're here. That means something. It means you are willing to see, to feel the discomfort of knowing you've been lied to ask what else has been hidden, and you are not alone. There are others, quiet voices rising from shadowed corners, artists, dreamers, former priests, historians, rebels, people tracing the past not to destroy it but to free it. People who understand that light belongs to everyone, not just the chosen few. So carry it, protect it, pass it on. They will try to smother it again, they always have. But this time it's different. This time we remember, and remembering changes everything. To you, who have followed every shadow, every whisper, every hidden thread, thank you. Thank you for not turning away when the story grew strange, uncomfortable, or too vast to believe. Thank you for holding your curiosity like a lantern in the dark, for daring to ask the questions others were too afraid to speak. The journey doesn't end here. You are now part of the story of the light that refuses to die, of truth that cannot be buried forever. Keep looking, keep asking, keep passing the flame, because the world changes one mind, one question, one remembered truth at a time. Comment what you think on this video.